So Father Chris says that we have until 11:30, and then he'll stand up 5 minutes to give me my warning. And we'll continue. So we have basically another period tomorrow. So we'll just keep on going and continue all the way through tomorrow what we can't deal with today. So during the break, hang on a second. During the break, a question came about dialysis. And so I'd like to speak about dialysis at the moment. So the question came up, and I understand some of you have already encountered this. You know, someone who has had kidney failure, who's been on dialysis, say 5, 10, 15 years, they come to you and they say, Father, you know, I'm tired of dialysis. Like, I just want to get off it. And so the question is, how do you respond to that? My suggestion to you is to distinguish two situations. The situation that you have to guard against is someone who's suicidal. So you can imagine someone who's depressed, who is suicidal, who actually sees this as a way of shortening their life. Here you have to deal with the depression. You have to deal with it. But you can also see the situation and where someone is saying, you know, my port on the left side's failing, the port on the right side is failing. They're trying to find all sorts of ports to stick in, the needles. And I've had a full life, and it's become incredibly financially burdensome to my family. It's really inconvenient. I've gone to confession. I'm ready to meet the Lord. I've talked to my wife, talked to my kids. They understand that, you know, I'm ready. I could see where that's a reasonable thing to say. And at that point, yes, you know, that person has been able to make that moral judgment that further dialysis is actually more burdensome than the benefit that it would accrue to that person. Now, the situation is different, for example, if the person is like on a waiting list for a kidney transplant. So if they were on the waiting list for a kidney transplant, you might imagine where another 2 weeks and they get that transplant, so you wait on another 2 weeks. But this may or may not be the case depending upon where you are in the country, because the availability of organs of organs for transplantation differs from one place to another place in the country. Does that make sense? Other questions, fathers? Did you have a question, or was that your... Again, it's the same thing. You know, and you can listen to them, and if they are reasonable, if they're able to articulate, you know, why it's just exhausting, they're tiring, you can say, yeah. And especially if you hear, Father, I've had a wonderful life. I'm ready to go. And when I've heard that, I know everything's okay. You know, and they're ready to go, and you just let them. You got to let them go. And as I point out, 100 years ago, they would have been dead already. You see? Not even 100. 30 years ago, they would be dead already. So there's a sense where they in their mind, they are already living on, quote, borrowed time. And so they want to go, and we should allow them to go. Father?
There's a lot of different perceptions. People talk about quality of life, all of this, doing all of this. What do you think?
So notice, and not only that, we never make a moral judgment on someone's life. We are making a judgment on the medical intervention that is being dealt with. However, that person, and only that person, the patient himself or herself, only that patient can judge truly if they've lived a good life. And they use that in order to decide their burdens and benefits analysis. The difficulty is in our secular age, doctors take it upon themselves to judge the quality of life of their patient, and then based on that, make further medical decisions. That we cannot do. That we must hesitate. We must push back against that, because the danger there is we're moving down a slippery slope towards euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, because now we can say, well, just because you're disabled, you're not valuable enough, and so your quality of life is poor. But what we're saying poor is It's inconvenient for my quality of life. See, this is the difficulty, is that when people judge quality of life, they're often judging their quality of life because of the patient they've got to care for, rather than properly judging the quality of life of the patient, which we can never and cannot do.
You have a living will.
We will talk about that shortly when we talk about how to, after all, I need to make sure we understand the framework in where we make good, virtuous, and vicious decisions at the end of life, and then we say, okay, how do we do it before you're dying? Father? Yeah, that is a completely different... so usually what happens is they will not put it in terms of quality of life. What they will try to do there is they will say the cost of the new hip is not justified by X, Y, or Z, where X, Y, or Z is often associated with the future productivity of the patient. So they may couch it in terms of quality of life, but they're really trying to do a calculus of how valuable you are. And we must push back against that. That is that denigrates the dignity of the human person. Because I point out to my students, you don't have a price. You have dignity. And once we must say that over and over, we do not have a price. You can never put a number to a person's life, because we only do that with sub-rational creatures. And as soon as we do that, we fall into, we completely undermine everything about the person. Which is why, yesterday, one of your brothers brought up IVF. And a lot of people will say, what's really wrong with IVF? And I say, well, and we can talk about this tomorrow if you wish me to. The difficulty with IVF is that it instrumentalizes and commercializes people, right? So, like I tell my students, if you want a human egg, you can go online. They're about, well, it depends. If she went to the Ivy League, they're about $50,000 a pop. But if you just went to the local community college, the egg is only about $20,000, $25,000. So what's really interesting now, you see, is we're now commodifying people based upon so many other things, and that industry is associated with that tendency, which is why we must resist that whole thing. In spite of the great good, and when I speak about this, we must always say, the child who is conceived is beautiful. The child who is conceived is wonderful. Because I have people who say, well, because the child was conceived with IVF, he obviously can't have a soul. And I'm going, whoa, let's stop. We have to make a distinction between the child who is beautiful, made in the image and likeness of God, and the means by which he or she was conceived. We have to separate the two. Other questions, Father?
I had a young cousin in his 20s in a bad car accident, and it was some time before medical attention was available. And doctors would say, well, we can't save him, but, he's not going to be
functioning.
He's not going to be able to breathe on his own. Is it morally okay to refuse that? And the other thing is, he was 14 years in that state. Can you remove that breathing apparatus?
Okay, so since I'm not quite sure of the exact situation involved there, but I will say in general. So say, for example, let's go back to pre-14 years, and this 20-year-old comes in and is diagnosed with such a severe injury that the only hope of recovery is recovery to a state where that person is heavily disabled. And so now the family members have to make a decision, right? Now, one of the things that's very tricky here is doctors often make a mistake on the proper prognosis, so we have got to take that into account. But if you have a second or third opinion and it's very clear that the damage is so profound that no reasonable person can be expected to survive. Now, was the person conscious? Okay. Pre-PVS. So you can imagine where you say, look, at this point, the actual treatment, the benefit of the treatment, okay, so the benefit of the treatment is not much. what is the benefit of the treatment? You are going to bring them back from the brink of death, but you're putting them in a situation where they're heavily disabled. Now, so that's the benefit. The burden is a lifelong, the financial and the familial burdens associated with caring for that person. If the family decides, that at this point the person is so injured that trying to bring them back really just will not bring them back. And this is this is related to the DNR. So the do not resuscitate is this very same argument. So when we say, I do not want CPR done to me, I do not want DNR, so I have a DNR on me, what I'm saying is this medical procedure to get my heart beating again may work, but it will only bring me back for another week or so, and it will cause great damage to me that I actually do not want the doctor to resuscitate me and allow me to die. This is the same kind of argument we would make in this case. We would say, yes, in this particular case, we could simply let the person die because the medical intervention is not going to be as beneficial as we would want it to be. There's a difference, though, once this has been done, and once 15 years have passed, and the person is stable. You see, so when a person goes through a traumatic situation like traumatic injury, the body enters a period of instability that can last several months. And in that point, they're usually in the ICU. So this is why a person is in the ICU. They're in the ICU. The body's kind of adjusting to this injury. And at that point, if you withdraw, the body will die. It's actually unstable. But if you let it get past through this moment of crisis and the body reorganizes itself, right, then what ends up happening is it's fine. At that point, you see, if you withdraw artificial hydration and nutrition, you're actually, the patient will die from starvation and from dehydration. So that's a very different situation. So at that point, I'd say, no, you cannot do that. Breathing from the breathing tube actually is different. So there's actually a distinction made between a breathing tube and hydration, artificial hydration, nutrition, because, and it's interesting, we never breathe for another human being, but we feed and nourish them. So phenomenologically, I would never breathe you, and there's no obligation for me to breathe for you, but there is a moral obligation as a human being for me to feed you and to nourish you when you are incapable of doing that. So we do make that difference between ventilation and hydration and nutrition. Other questions? So now let's get to brain death. Okay? So we are actually already talking about this. Now, in order for me to talk about brain death, I need to talk about death. Okay? So brain death is associated with the definition of death. Now, philosophically, death is the separation of the soul from the body. So we have to start there. Okay. Now, here's the problem. We can't see the soul. So I can't tell if the soul is in that body or not. You see? And so if you want to go into a doctor's, if you are going to provide medical criteria for death, you need to go from philosophy, and you have to move from philosophy to medicine. And the way we do that is we ask the question, what does a soul do? And what a soul does, one of the things a soul can do, is that it integrates the body. Your body is one body. Monsignor's body here is not 10 different parts. It's one whole. And, his eye is his eye, his finger is his finger, his foot is his foot. And the reason why all of these different parts are part of Monsignor's body as a whole is because of his soul. So his soul integrates and unifies his body. So once we get there, and that's a philosophical, metaphysical argument going back to Aristotle and St. Thomas, We now ask the doctors, can you provide clinical tests so that we can tell if the body is integrated or not? See, that's really what we are asking when we come to death, because that's where the doctors come in. Now, you see, this is a medical thing. And so it's the medical purview of the doctors to provide this. Now, in 1740, when I was first started doing this, I went to the Library of Congress, and there's a book written in 1740 in the United States, and it's in the rare book collection, called On the Signs of Death and Dying. Because it turns out that diagnosing death is not a new thing. So it turns out that often, people were buried alive, which is why I didn't know this until I saw pictures. If you go several centuries ago, when you had a cemetery, they would put a little piece of string around the finger of the corpse, and it would be threaded through the coffin, and there'd be a little bell right above the tomb for about a week. And basically, the reason why you had someone who cared for the cemetery was not to make sure there were flowers there. So, we assume like the caretaker of the cemetery is to like mow the lawn. And he was there to listen for the bell if you woke up and you were buried 6 feet under. And we actually know that there are people who were buried 6 feet under. You know why? Because when we uncover their tomb, we can see the scratching on the cover of the coffin. So we knew that they were buried alive. Ooh. Okay. So in 1740, this is the very first book in the US of A. They want to figure out how to come up with diagnostic criteria for death. So things included things like take a feather, put it in front of the nostril, look at feather. The other one, take glass of water, put glass of water on chest, and look at the surface of the water to see if there is any movement whatsoever. You see, this is already in medicine, 1740. They're struggling to figure this out. Then it got things like, all right, we're going to start tickling the soles of the feet. And then just to make sure, you take a scalding iron and you shove it up against the feet and you see if they wake up. Okay, now, this actually, if you believe it or not, we have done this in the Catholic Church for centuries with the death of the Pope. When a Pope dies, what do? They have the little hammer, right? They tap and what do they call him by? His given name, the name that his mother would have called him. Because the assumption is that if you were still alive, the one thing that would get you up and going was what your mother calling you. It's a very interesting. Now, obviously today, when our Holy Father, now St. John Paul II died, he was attached to, they were listening for his heart. But you see, historically, we had this, and you had to, knock the Holy Father's head, and I don't know what, I guess it would be Bergoglio, is he awake? So you see, this is an ancient problem. This is an ancient problem. Now, so for most of history, the assumption is if you weren't breathing and if your heart had stopped, you were dead. Change happens in 1968. In 1968, a committee at Harvard basically says that irreversible coma is, in fact, equivalent to death. Okay? Now, this is interesting, right? So they go, it is death. Now, the reason they give for this is that once you enter an irreversible coma, all of their cases of irreversible coma, within a couple of weeks, the patient had died. Really died. The heart stopped, the lungs stopped. So it appeared that once you entered a state of irreversible coma, your integration of your body was gone, and your body was basically dying, and eventually it would die to the point where your heart stopped and your breathing stopped. So in 1968, confirmed by the President's Council in 1980, which is now the law of this land and the law of most of the West, is that irreversible coma or brain death is equivalent to death. Okay? Now, so what is brain death? What is irreversible? Basically, the idea is that your brain, the whole brain, has been destroyed and damaged in an irreversible way. So patients who are irreversibly, who are in brain death, are unable to breathe on their own, so they're ventilated, which is why I'm assuming that the individual that you're talking about was a brain dead. Because what keeps you breathing is actually the brain stem down here, and which is why this is if you get smacked here, this is the part that keeps you conscious. And I'll give you this thing. Have you ever woken up, and just as you wake up, you're awake, but your body's still asleep, and you're like, and you can't move yet. Like it's like you're still paralyzed. You're awake, but you can't move. Some people can experience that. What happens there is the lower part, the conscious part, is awake, but the motor part is still sleeping. And so what happens is you're paralyzed. Because I don't know if you noticed, when you're sleeping, you're paralyzed. If you're not paralyzed, and there are some people who are not paralyzed when you're sleeping, we call this sleepwalking. So most people don't sleepwalk because they're actually paralyzed when they're sleeping. Some of us are not paralyzed when we sleep. And so when we dream about walking, we actually walk. See, and that's part of the whole thing. So once you're completely brain dead, the whole thing's gone. The upper part, the lower part is gone. You can't breathe on your own, so you're ventilated. But your heart is going and you're breathing. You are warm. Everything looks the same except you're on a vent. And the diagnoses of this now involve things like seeing if there's blood flow in your head. Okay? And so for the last 30 years or so, it has become accepted that a brain-dead patient is in fact dead because they have lost integration. And because they've lost integration, the soul is not there. And because the soul is not there, what you actually have is just a living corpse. Very strange way of only modernity when we talk about a living corpse. And this is where we have now the possibility of organ donation. It's not surprising, by the way, historically, that the Harvard Committee, the ad hoc committee in 1968, comes up with this definition shortly after the first heart transplant, a successful heart transplant. So it actually opens up the possibility of transplantation. So for the Catholic tradition, the year 2000, our Holy Father, now St. John Paul II, basically at a Congress on organ transplantation that I happened to be at the time, he basically says, the Church, after 30 years of reflecting on this, has discerned that this medical criteria is not incompatible with an authentic Christian anthropology. Now this is a very clear, the Church does not speak for medicine because the Church is not an institution of medical doctors. But what the Church discerns is that the medical criteria that physicians propose appear to be compatible with an authentic understanding of the human person. And I presented that data to you. When you are brain dead, when you're irreversibly in a coma, within a couple of weeks, your heart stops, your brain stops, your breathing stops, so your body seems to be falling apart, suggesting that the soul is not there. And so today, when I speak to nurses and doctors, I say, this is what Catholic nurses and doctors, this is what the Catholic Church at this point in the year 2000 is thinking. Okay, now, there is a fly in the ointment now because of a Catholic physician, neurologist, pediatric neurologist, Alan Schumann, working at UCLA. And in the last 20 years, Alan, great guy, regular communicant, believer, what he actually, because he's a pediatric neurologist, he had to take care of children who are brain dead. And what he actually discovered is that if you keep the brain dead patient on the ventilator for several months past a crisis point, they stabilize and they can live 20 years. And there's a very famous case called TK, a young kid in Japan. He was involved in an accident of some sort, and he was brain dead at 6. In Japanese culture, the brain death criteria has not been accepted. So his mother took him home, and she cared for him in their living room, and he went through puberty. He grew. Whenever he got sick, she would give him pneumonia. She would give him drugs. So, and now there's some dispute as to whether or not the puberty he went through was the real puberty. But it's clear that if the body is able to stay together for 20 years, it suggests that it has not lost integration. And if it has not lost integration, then the soul probably is still there. You see how it gets really complicated now? Because now, and if the soul is there, then what happens is the person is actually alive and is still, but is just heavily disabled. This is where, so all I can tell you is for now, when I speak to people, I say that the most recent articulation of the church's thinking on this, dating back to 2000, is that that brain death is in fact legitimate death. But I also point out that because of this new data, you see how the church, when speaking on faith and morals, relies on scientists and doctors for that data. That data is changeable. And in fact, what we're seeing now is that data is changing. And in fact, 2 weeks from now, I have to go to Washington, D.C. to be part of this debate about re-examining the Catholic Church's, at least in the United States, re-examining the arguments for and against the validity of the neurological criteria to see whether or not they still conform to an authentic Christian anthropology. That's where things are right now. Okay? Father.
The science of this then bears on the issue of the brain-dead pregnant woman.
Yes.
We recently had this, I guess.
Just last 6 months ago, right?
There's been a number of these. Germans have some studies. Now, they have this data for this about how long, and there's quite a bit of variation on how long she can continue
gestating. Well, I mean, okay, so one of the arguments I have made for the integration of the brain death patient is having a baby is an integrated function. Because, well, there are no women here, but when I've talked to women who've had babies, you just don't need a uterus to have a baby. You need, like, the whole thing. The uterus is talking to the heart. The uterus is talking to the liver. The whole thing is integrated so that any adjustments in the baby will be compensated for by the body. And so the arguments that are at one side of this debate is saying that the brain-dead patient is still integrated, and since integration is the only sign of the soul that we know of, then we have to give the soul the benefit of the doubt. So that's where the debate is today. Now, pastorally speaking, what does this mean for you and for me? What this means is, when I speak, and this is where it will come up in your pastoral care. Johnny has been involved in a vehicular accident after graduation, in the after party. Very sad, very tragic. He's had so the doctors diagnosed brain death in the local hospital. They approach mom and dad, who are devastated, of course, and they say, would you approve donating his organs? This is where it's tricky now. See? Now, what I say pastorally is when I'm talking to parents who are in this devastated state and they're trying to discern this, I do not bring up the academic and scholarly dispute that I just described to you. It is not helpful to someone who is just devastated. What I say is this. I say, In 2000, the Holy Father, John Paul II, said that the neurological criteria, to the best as we understand it at that time, it equates brain death to death. That's what I say. Now, with regards to organ donation, the Catholic Church, John Paul, Benedict, one of the things that about organ donation is organ donation has been equated to the most radical gift of self you can give to another person. Now, you cannot give every organ in your body, by the way, right? You can't give an organ that will kill you, a critical organ. I can't give you my heart if I'm alive. Now, I can give you one of my kidneys, but I cannot give you one of my eyes. And you go, what's the difference between one of my eyes and one of my kidneys? The criteria is called functional integrity. I need two eyes to see in the way that human beings see, which is binocular vision. If I only have one eye, I have monocular vision, I'm not able to perceive depth as well as I could if I had two. If I remove one kidney, what actually happens is the second kidney grows in size and practically doubles in size, and you end up recovering most of the kidney function that you had prior to the removal of the kidney. So from the Catholic Church's, from the moral tradition of the Catholic Church, you are able to donate, if you are alive, a kidney or an organ or a part of an organ as long as it does not compromise your functional integrity. So this can include like part of your liver because your liver regenerates. See, if I take up a part of your liver, the remaining liver will just grow in and it will recuperate your liver, which is why we have donation of blood. Because if I give you part of my blood, my bone marrow will produce more blood. Same thing with skin, you see. So, but you cannot give a organ that will compromise your functional integrity. That will involve an act of mutilation. Now, if you are deceased, if you die, things are different. You can give your heart, you can give your lungs. The only thing you cannot give are your gonads. So you cannot give your ovary, you cannot give your testicles. Why? Because your gonads are so, as a person, is so intimately linked to your identity that if one person gives his testicles to a total stranger, whose kid will be conceived? You see, it gets a little complicated because what happens now is your identity, which is so tied to your ability to procreate, right? It gets more and more complicated. So right now, well, I can tell you the arguments have been made where we do not allow the transplantation of testicles or ovaries for that reason, though it has been done, for example, amongst identical twins. So there are two women where one woman gave her identical twins, and where are the twins? Right? There's one twin. Gave one, in identical twins, your genes are identically the same. So if you give one ovary to your identical twin, technically, it's just as good as the original ovary. See? So it's a little tricky. Questions now. I think the best way, instead of me saying anymore, let me just open the floor to questions. Father.
That last instance, are you saying that's kind of more reason? Because what you've got is, let's say you've got Joan and Jane, and Joan gives Jane, then Joan is the mother of Jane's child, and I don't...
Well, see, this is...
That with Catholic...
Well, see, this is the thing, right? So, it's a very tricky... One of the things that we have to keep in mind that the Catholic moral tradition acknowledges first and foremost that because of Christ, you and I are adopted. So, you and I are adopted of sons of the Father. So, the notion of genetic identity is not as... It's important, but it's not as strong as, say, in my colleagues who are secular philosophers and theologians who don't have a very strong sense of adoption, and how adopted children are just as much your child as your child who might be genetically related to you. I'm just going to say that, especially when regard to IVF. This comes up a lot because when someone is infertile, we talk about adoption. In that case, you see, but nonetheless, we do acknowledge that there is a link between your child and you through the genetic material that you give to your child. Now, when there are two women who are identical twins, their genetic material is actually completely identical. So if I take the egg from Joan and I take the egg from Jane, they are identical. And in fact, I can switch them, and there's no way you could distinguish Joan's egg from Jane's egg in a way that you could distinguish Joan's egg from Mary's egg. So what happens is this. Now, you may or may not know this, that women are born with all the eggs that they have, right? We, on the other hand, we produce sperm every 7 days. It's a very different kind of biology. So if you take an ovary from Joan and you put it into Jane, there are many immature eggs in that ovary that now the recipient woman will have to, in a sense, nurture and bring, and the word is, she has to ripen those eggs. And so, in a sense, she is doing something to those eggs as well. It's not simply like we're moving, the egg from one to the other. We're actually moving the ovary. And because she's genetically identical, that her body will accept that ovary as hers. And what will happen then is her soul will then inform that ovary. And so that ovary becomes hers in a way that organ transplantation between non-identical twins is never. So if I received a kidney from father here, I would have to take drugs for the rest of my life so that I will not reject that kidney. And what that means philosophically is that my soul cannot inform that kidney. So that kidney is forever different than me, which is why I need to take those drugs. But once Joan receives that ovary from Jane, because they're genetically identical, her soul can actually inform that ovary, and then that egg becomes her egg. It becomes her egg in the way that it would have been hers because it's got her soul. You see? So that's the philosophical argument that is made for that. Sorry for getting into the philosophical. Other questions? Father? So given the state of question, if he was truly brain dead, because you could imagine where this part of the brain was destroyed, and so he couldn't breathe on his own, but there were other parts of the brain that were not destroyed. Okay, but say he was truly brain dead and he's dead, and as we understand it today, yes, you could then withdraw because technically he's dead. Okay. Father?
All of those organs, Father, can be harvested after the person has died.
Within, it depends. So certain organs need to be harvested sooner than others. So it really depends on how long time has passed. So certain organs are more sensitive. So you may have come across people who have asked you about organ donation, and the church's position is that it is an act of total self-gift. The same thing can be said about donating your body to science. So sometimes, in fact, one of my brothers who loved science all his life, at the end of his life, he donated his body to science at Georgetown University School of Medicine. And there are a couple of stipulations that have to be done to respect. Now, here's the thing, right? The body of a human being is not a human person. But it is also not identical to the body of an animal because it bore There is a dignity to the deceased remains of that body that is not equivalent to the dignity that the human being had when he was alive, but it's still dignified in the sense there's certain things you can and cannot do with it. So a question came up yesterday. They are now making, after someone is cremated, they are now doing all sorts of things with the cremains. So they're making things like you have, daddy's cremains can be now part of a little pin that you can pin to your shirt every day of your life. You can actually, you have to try pastorally to resist that. And the way that I have explained, one of the things that I say to people who ask me that, I say, talk to your father. You don't need to, we assume, you see, the part is because of the secularization, the idea is that because I have a little few grains of daddy's dust with me, he is now close to me in a way that he was not close to me before. And I say, when someone dies and their soul, God willing, goes to heaven or purgatory, they're closer to you there than they're close to you now. And I say, so I encourage people to to re-enchant their imagination so they're able to imagine, I can talk to Daddy and I'm closer to him now. And it might be good not to have him around me all the time, his physical remains, because that's all there is. I tell them, that's just the physical remains. He is not there. And he is closer to you, especially at the Holy Mass. This is where I tell them, go to Mass and encourage them, because at the altar is where both the church militant and the church triumphant are all together, right? So I say that's where you will be closest to your loved ones. And I try to re-enchant their imagination so that they can say, okay, I don't need to do that. Because if you ask them why they need to have these little pits of Daddy on the mantle or underneath their bed, it's because they think they need that physical closeness, which they don't need to go to, because there are other ways they can think through this. Father? I know. Well, and no. No, and no, again, it's just like, you have to be careful, right? My confessor first do no harm. And so you listen. Now, this is what usually happens, actually. I've found this to be the case. 5 years later, when they've healed from the grief, you see, so you can't talk about that right now because they're grieving. But 5 years later, they go, maybe it's okay not to have Daddy on the mantle of the house every day. And you see, so now they're open. And so the way that I do it is, this is where you don't do it one-on-one, but you might one day talk about it from the pulpit, so that people who have remains of their loved ones with them will, now that they have healed and moved on beyond the 3-year grieving period, they can begin to think, maybe, Father said that at Mass today, maybe I should worry about, well, not worry, but maybe I should consider taking the remains that are here and now interring them in some columbarium somewhere. A columbarium, so this is where you have, it's a mausoleum for cremains. Father. That's a wonderful.
Whether this is approved, at least from the Catholic Church perspective, I guess something.
That's a wonderful. I like that. So maybe you can kind of preempt, because many of our people don't know they can make a pin out of Daddy's remains. You have to present it to them as such. So maybe it would be good, if you have, especially since in this diocese you know your people well, you may want to suggest that if this is a Catholic family, it may not be appropriate for you to speak about this to them, blah, 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 blah. I like that. Father? Well, that's a very interesting thing. I mean, so, there has been a resurgence about relics because of eBay. And now, if you want relics, you go on eBay now, and you can get them. And it's really, really, I mean, what started off as a practice where the memory of the martyrs, remember, it's the memory of the martyrs, was placed under the altar of sacrifice, that is now become commercialized and commodified. So it's not surprising that, if you can go on eBay and they say, you're bidding for the reliquary, not the relic. Yeah, wink, wink, wink. And you're going to pay $800 for that relic with papers now, and everything. And that, I have a problem with that. I have a problem with that entire. But you're correct. Once that mentality sets in with where relics, and it becomes, and it's also, this is where we have to preach, where relics are understood to be magical tokens, right? And becomes, so there's a distortion and a corruption of the way that the Catholic people understand relics, where it's used like to ward off the evil eye or something really, where it's surrounded with superstition, yes. And if you may hear about that because with this eBay thing, and I know people who've come to me and they're like, St. Dominic is online now and there's a bid, and so, what are you going to try to do about that? And other questions? 5 minutes. Well, let's, Scola Brevis. So let's end here so that you can hear from your bishop. And tomorrow, what I'd like to do is talk about all of the advanced care directives that we didn't have a chance to cover today. If you have any more questions, if I forgot a question that you've given me, the one I will deal with embryo adoption and snowflakes tomorrow because several of you have approached me on that. But if there are any other questions that you would like me to address, please just hand me a note or something, or just mention it to me in line and just say, could you address this? I want to get through that advanced care directive to make sure you can help prepare your people for end-of-life issues. But we'll have some time at the end to finish. All right? Our help is in the name of the Lord.